This unit is on occupational therapy in the school system. So the next few slides are going to look at some of the more important concepts and that you need to know regarding the school system. So these are the objectives. During the 1960s and early 1970s, the educational needs of children with disabilities were not being met, and more than half of the children with disabilities did not receive appropriate educational services. It's been estimated that approximately 1 million children with disabilities were excluded from public school system or denied the opportunity to experience the educational process with their peers because of their disability. Because of the lack of adequate services, families were often forced to seek services outside the public school system at their own expense. As a result, there were a couple of major Supreme Court decisions that kind of led the way to the laws that were enacted. So in 1975, there was the first Education Act allowed for. It's Public Law 94-142. That's the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. Over the course of years, it has evolved and improved, and currently the piece of legislation that we work under is called IDEA, or it's Individuals with Disability Education Act. To have an understanding of occupational therapy in the schools, we have to have a little bit of an understanding of federal and state regulations. So federal regulations are rules generated by administrative agencies to help implement laws. The rules interpret and translate the broad and non-specific policies and procedures outlined within the law. And in this case, it's the U.S. Department of Education which generated the regulations for IDEA. There is also a federal law, but it's an act of Congress, and it's divided into different subparts to give a little more specific guidance. Then that's at the federal level. Then each state has the ability to narrow down the focus or the scope of practice. In Louisiana, the piece of legislation that guides practice in the school system is called the Regulations for Students with Disabilities, or RS 17-1941, and this addresses special education related services. There's many sections within this law, but to just pinpoint our focus on occupational therapy, it has it provides services for early intervention, which is children birth to 3 years of age, and under that, OT is defined as a direct service, which means we can go into practice directly with the child individually, and we don't have to have another discipline, but we could be the sole and only service that is provided for that particular child. It doesn't have a bearing on any other qualifications for direct services. In the early intervention, you have the Individuals with Family Service Plan, so it's focused on not only the services are provided for not only the child but also the family that the child is in. But when the child turns 3, yes, they provide services from up to through their 21st birthday. So the occupational therapy is then determined, is then defined as a related service. The child first has to qualify for special education services prior to being able to obtain the occupational therapy service. So it's related to another discipline. Another piece of important guideline is the Bulletin 1508, and this is the Pupil Appraisal Handbook, which is very specific in terms of what rules or the process is for evaluating and qualifying students for not only special education but also the related services. The primary purpose of Part B of IDEA is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that includes special education and related services to meet their unique needs. In addition, this needs to be the provision of education needs to be provided in what's called the least restrictive environment. And this means that children with disabilities are educated with other children who are not disabled to the maximum extent when appropriate. So some children have a lot of emotional outbursts or are inappropriate and very distractive to other children in the environment, might be in not be in a regular classroom but be pulled out during part of the day, or they might be placed in a self-contained classroom where they're not really with the general education students the majority of the day. It spells out the eligibility requirements, the disability categories, and what kind of services are going to be provided in the child's IEP. Another important piece of legislation that's important for you to understand is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the American Disabilities Act. And this allows for students to participate in the general curriculum. It's was actually 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is a civil rights statute that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities. And it requires school districts with students with disabilities to provide accommodations to allow access to educational programs and associated activities to the same extent as students without disability. So this primarily provides accommodations and modifications. It's probably geared more towards students who have learning disabilities and attention difficulties. The children are, with this classification, are going to be, they usually spend their entire school day in a general education classroom. And modifications are made. It might be things like special seating, or a quiet room for test taking, somebody to take notes for the student. So it's just that the distractions within the environments make it challenging for an individual to learn like other children, and so these accommodations or modifications are made. The primary outcomes that the American Occupational Therapy Association has identified for practitioners in the schools are classroom skills, playground sports participation, self-help. I'm not going to read the whole list. You can see them there. We're going to talk a little bit about each one of these. And it's also important to use evidence-based interventions to support the practice. For children to qualify for occupational therapy services in the school, they first have to meet certain eligibility requirements and be categorized as needing special education, and then once that's in place, then they have to qualify for OT. So we're going to talk a little bit about eligibility requirements and what that means. So when you're talking about special education, so the children are going to be evaluated by pupil appraisal, and there's specific guidelines that they go by to determine the exceptionality that or the diagnosis, if you will, that the child has and the problems that might impact them in terms of their education and learning. And special education includes placement in a number of different services. The first is what you might think of typically as special education, and this is a self-contained classroom, and this is where the children would be in class with other children with special needs and stay in the same classroom the whole time. This is probably the most restrictive environment. And then you have what's called resource, and resource would be the children would be in regular education part of the day, and then for areas where they need extra help, they would go to resource rooms. They might be pulled out into a self-contained classroom, if you will, and maybe for language arts or math or science or whatever the subject was that the child need extra instruction or modified instruction. But for part of the day they're going to be in regular ed. And then you have what's called inclusion. And inclusion is where students are in their homeroom of regular education all day long. They might still require extra help or modifications or in instruction, but the teachers and the support personnel goes to the classroom to provide that support. So the child's not pulled out of the classroom at all. And the fourth way that a child receives special education is when they're homebound. They might be medically fragile, and the teachers and therapists would go to the child's home to provide those services there. Okay, so that's the first. In order for a child to receive OT in the school, the first thing that has to happen is they need to qualify. They need to be eligible for special education. Then they have to qualify for OT. They have to demonstrate a motor impairment. Either they are developmentally behind, or they have a motor impairment, or they have sensory motor problems. Three ways are probably the most common ways that children are referred for both OT and PT services. But the three main ways are pupil appraisal, and this is where there's an evaluation team once the children are identified, and there's an educational diagnostician and a school psychologist, the determination that the OT services might be needed. It might be the teacher, or they have a service in Louisiana called Child Find, and for preschool children, kindergarten age children, they want to try to make sure they get them where they need to be placed as early as possible. And so they might do a screening and determine that a child is in need for services. In your packet of information for the module and school system, you have a PDF from a book called Practical Considerations for School-Based Occupational Therapy, and in that packet is a sample referral form. I think it would be a good idea to look at that, and so that you can see what kinds of questions or what kinds of things that educators might need to look for to make the referral for occupational therapy. Once a child is referred to OTs, sometimes the children are screened kind of borderline. They're not really sure if whether or not they would qualify for services, if they need any services. So they might do a screening, and we'll talk specifically about that here in a second. Or they might do a screening that would say yes, they would benefit, and they'd have to do a comprehensive evaluation. I'm going to distinguish the difference between evaluation and assessment. An evaluation is the big picture. This is going to include things like your occupational profile, all the data that you collect from the people that you talk to that work with the child or know the child, which it may include the parent, and it's also include the results of clinical observations and any assessment tools that you might administer. And then the assessment itself is a specific tool, norm referenced, so that it's comparing children of the same chronological age to determine if there is a problem, or it might be criterion referenced in that it just really looks at the tasks that a child should be able to do and determine whether or not the child can or cannot accomplish that task. So the screening, there's different ways that you can gather the information from a screener. It may just be an observation of the child in the class, or it might be if they have, for example, gross motor problems, you might go out on the playground to observe what they're doing there, or social participation problems. Can they play well with the other children? Do they have difficulty eating, or is the watching the kids in the cafeteria, maybe watching them get on and off the bus, toileting, that type of thing. Able to attend or follow directions. So whatever the specific problem is, you just watch them in their natural environment throughout their school day to determine whether or not they would benefit. And okay, so now I'm going to just give you some names of some specific tools. The first one is fine motor, and two very common and well-constructed assessment tools are the Peabody of Developmental Motor Scales, or the PDMS, or Bruininks-Ozoretsky Test of Motor Proficiency, or the BOT-2. It's a little easier to pronounce than the Bruininks-Ozoretsky. PDMS-2 is standardized on children from birth to 6 years of age, and the BOT goes from 4 to 21 years of age. And when we get in our assessment course, we'll talk more specifically about these tools. But just to know that there's a fine motor and a gross motor section on both of them, of which OT would do the fine motor part. There's also a criterion referenced assessment that's used. These EIDP and the PDP. The EIDP is looks at specific tasks in 6 different domains, but there is a fine motor section there and a self-care section that the OT might administer. And the EIDP goes from birth to 3 years, and the PDP from 3 to 6 years of age.